being able to retain talented women has a huge value proposition, because if you can do this well and your competitors can't do this well, then you win with this type of talent. A lot of firms think that what working moms need is flexibility. It's not actually flexibility that women are seeking, it's boundaries. When we invest in women and invest in making their lives more sustainable, we are literally investing in the future of humanity, the survival of our nations and our species.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Lavin Voices, a podcast from the Lavin Agency. I'm your host, Charles Yao, and our guest today is Corinne Low. Corinne is the author of Having It All, What Data Tells Us About Women's Lives and How to Get the Most Out of Yours. It's sort of like an Atomic Habits, but for women at work and for the companies that employ them. It's already become a major contribution to discussions around the future of work and the ever-escalating war for talent. At core, it asks, what can a workplace look like where women can thrive? It's about creating a democratic workplace, a really under-discussed part of a democratic society. Eve Rodsky, the author of Fair Play, says this groundbreaking book will have an impact on the life of the reader and the society that surrounds them. Corinne is an associate professor of business economics and public policy at the Wharton School. She teaches one of the university's highest rated classes. Her work's been featured in American Economic Review and Vanity Fair. How's that for breadth? And she's recently appeared on CBS Morning, and maybe you read her viral New York Times op-ed this month. I'm really happy to discuss these important topics with Corinne. Here's our conversation. Just to start, maybe we can just situate the new book, Having It All. Obviously, it's about how women at work can get ahead. I think on the flip side, it's also about how companies can help women get ahead. But perhaps we can situate it within the larger purview of books like this. There's been a large body of work trying to, crack this nut, as it were, a lot of it written by you. So in the pantheon of books like this, how does this one stand out? What's the unique 2025, 26 take on things?
Well, I think what I bring to the table is a lot of the evidence on how things have changed to make this Having It All uniquely challenging at this moment. So I talk about how the way we use our time has changed and how this affects, women as well as men in the workplace, that parenting has become more intensive than ever before. And jobs have also become more intensive. And so kind of the hours in the day don't add up in the traditional way. And so I think part of what I'm encouraging people to do is to figure out what kind of it all means to them and figure out, how do I really streamline things to get the most out of my time in both domains, at work and at home. And so I think the unique thing about this book is that this is the book based on 15 years of my research of women in the workplace and at home, and, the decisions that they make, how their different traits interact with the workplace culture, places where women might be on average different from men but actually are more productive than men, and my research on women making decisions about the career family trade-off, what I call reproductive capital. And so this book is based on my body of work and trying to bring that to a wider audience so that it can help impact individual decision-making, help women carve out more happiness and joy for themselves amid those kind of walls that feel like they're closing in, but also affect how corporations think about this, because I think there's some kind of counterintuitive answers there in the book about how do you make a workplace kind of more female-friendly.
And we'll get to the count, because I love counterintuitive answers. But just very broadly, it's a big question, but the reason your book, I think, will resonate is that it does offer answers, counterintuitive answers, a new path forward. But that leads to the question, well, structurally, what is wrong now? What is actually not working?
So if you start back in kind of the 1950s, we had this model of division of responsibility where, husbands worked and then you had a full-time person, a wife, doing home production in the household. And that's actually how much work there is in terms of home production. There's actually kind of a full-time worth of work, right? And now gender roles have converged in the workplace where women are kind of playing the same roles as men in corporate America, but they haven't converged at home. We haven't seen men's time use change at home. home. So that leaves women kind of doing double duty. I call it winning the bread and baking it too. And that means that it's in some cases harder for them to kind of, as they say, lean in to these very high investment careers where it's not just about working 40 hours a week, right? It's about, working 60, 70, 80 hours a week and meeting client demands and, working with the team and getting ready to launch products and, all sorts of things like that. So those sort of high demand intensive careers, it's harder for women to kind of meet those demands, especially during this period of life that I call the squeeze, which is when you're making career investments and you have young kids at home that haven't started school yet. And because your career investments haven't paid off yet, you can't throw money at the problem the same way you might be able to kind of later in your career. So that is kind of all adding up into this like impossible bind. And then you introduce this additional twist, which I think this book is one of the first times that this story has been told, which is that the way we parent today is completely different than it was 30 years ago. So 30 years ago, there was not all of the baby wearing and talking to your toddler and playing with them on the floor and putting your, pre-K kid and, a million activities that are going to baby Einstein them, right? And, helping your kids with homework on the kitchen table and then driving to travel soccer on the weekends. That method of intensive parenting and really intensive mothering, because it's so often women who do more of it, is new and introduces a new use of time that is putting the squeeze on working parents. And so kind of amid all of those constraints, we have to figure out how to make it all add up where the answer isn't that, okay, well, she's going to be out of the labor force. And so I think firms that can solve this problem are going to have a real competitive edge, because if they can find a way to get women through that period of the squeeze, right, then you get to keep her forever. Then you get to keep the best talent forever. So I think this is something we should be collaborating on to say, hey, firms should be equally invested in this as women are, because if we solve this, this produces more talent in the labor force.
It's funny, the situation described seems like you have a finite amount of hours, and over the decades, we've just been filling the funnel of women's hours, clogging it almost more and more. You mentioned what can a firm do, an organization, a company do to help out? On the surface of it, it seems like almost an away from work problem, a personal problem. How are you going to structure your own household, which seems out of the purview of some organizations? So what are some takeaways that organizations can do to help women, as you say, get through the squeeze?
I have seen firms make a really big investment in hiring, amazingly talented women at the entry level. And we see a lot of professions that are increasingly kind of 50-50 at that entry level, okay? Then they make a huge investment in all of the training and learning associated with that entry level employee. And then when you look at the data, we see those women leave. We see them not showing up anymore. There's this, funnel by the time we get to the more senior ranks of the firm, right? Well, what a waste of that investment, both in getting that talent to a 50-50 level in the first place, which like I said, I think firms have really stepped up on, and then pouring investment into that talent, right? So this is a problem that I think firms want to solve, because if you can keep those workers, you're doubling your potential talent pool, again, not just for the entry-level associates, but for the managing directors, right? And so what can they do? Well, I think looking at the research can really guide them. So one, understanding how time use shifts over the life cycle and understanding actually how short the period is when women are being squeezed from all sides, right? And if they understand that, then they can understand, okay, actually, taking our lumps for this little period, right, where, women have young kids at home, where they're facing the squeeze, means I get a productive worker for life. And so that just means rethinking a little bit the investment path of a career, because what happens is the investment path often follows the life cycle of when parenting is the most intensive. And the reason for that is a biological constraint that after our 30s, women are much less able to have kids. And so we often have kids in our 30s. And that's often the period when our careers are taking off and salaries are appreciating most quickly while our reproductive capital is depreciating. So can we figure out ways to ease that period by putting, and it doesn't mean making it any less productive, but it does mean putting some structure and boundaries around work on that period. And so when I say boundaries, that's also driven by the research, because a lot of firms think that what working moms need is flexibility. You hear that term thrown around a lot, okay? Well, researchers have actually studied this, where they offered, this is a paper by Amanda Pallas and Alexandre Moss, and they offered female workers different types of jobs, some offering kind of flexible hours where people choose their own hours, but, still have the same number of hours in the work week, and some where they couldn't, where it was, structured 9 to 5. And women actually weren't willing to pay or give up very much pay to have that flexible work hours. What they found instead, though, is that there was a third type of job, which is called a manager discretion job, which is that instead of, flexible hours, and instead of 9 to 5, it's that the firm tells you, well, one day it might be, 6 to 11, and the next day we might need you 11 to 8, and then we might need you on the weekend, right? And women were willing to give up an enormous amount of pay to avoid that so-called manager discretion, okay? So what that tells me is that it's not actually flexibility that women are seeking, it's boundaries. It's that what's especially costly is evening and weekend work, and especially unpredictable evening and weekend work when kids aren't in childcare, right? So when we're saying, all right, if I have a 9 to 5 job, that's all I'm asking for. I don't need flexibility on top of that. That's perfect. That's the structure I need. The data also tells us, the profession of nursing that's very inflexible is 86% women. Why? Because it's very structured, because women are able to fit childcare around it. And in fact, they're even able to work overnight shifts as long as they can plan for that in advance, right? So what can corporate America take from that? Well, the more you can give people control and structure over their evening and weekend work, the more you're going to be able to survive through that squeeze period where they're going to be able to stay at their job, and do what they want to do at home, make these investments at home. So what does that look like? Well, technology has made it more possible. You have a rule that says FaceTime ends at 5 p.m. You can block out on your calendar 5 to 8 p.m. And then we can reconnect, remotely after 8 p.m., right? And that's what, for me on the tenure track with kids, that was what I did, is that, I had 5 to 8 p.m. was no work time. I had dinner and I put everybody to bed. And then I might have worked a lot when I was pre-tenure after 8 p.m., but it didn't interfere with the other investments that I wanted to make, right? Weekends on call, can firms think creatively to actually be like the nursing profession where you're going to have specific on-call shifts and other times you're not on call? So can you have 2 people who know this client's file inside and out, and you alternate weekends on call so that some people know, hey, this is a weekend where you get to be completely offline with your family, right? So again, thinking creatively, driven by the research, I think we can do better, and we can do it cheaper. And I mean that from the costs that firms pay to make these accommodations, right? Than if we just kind of guess at what we think women need.
What is the actual cost of companies fumbling in the economy, fumbling this squeeze period? Do we have a sense of how much this is actually costing corporate America?
My understanding of what the biggest constraints are that are facing firms right now say that the cost is enormous, because one of the biggest challenges that firms are facing right now is this talent squeeze, is a global talent market where they're having trouble finding, workers that are prepared enough, that have the skill set, that are educated enough for the roles that they have. And then when those workers exist, they're competing with everybody else for those same workers, right? And so there is this real war for talent. And that's very costly, because when you're trying to bid for the same talent, right, then you're paying that talent kind of more and more. And that's why, we've seen Silicon Valley firms really struggle with poaching by other firms and by startups and things like that, right? Because talent is everything in this economy. We are in the knowledge economy. We are not in the, manual labor economy now in the United States, kind of how our economy has evolved. It's a service-based knowledge economy. Talent is everything. So, and that doesn't change, by the way, with AI. I think some people think it does, but actually, these new technologies that are able to replace certain types of human labor make the kind of very high-end intellectual talent actually more valuable. They're complements rather than substitutes with that type of labor. And so that means that being able to retain talented women has a huge value proposition, because if you can do this well and your competitors can't do this well, right, then you win with this type of talent and you don't have to pay as much for it because you're not fighting somebody else for it. So I think there's a real profit motive for firms to distinguish themselves in being able to provide the kind of workplaces that, as I say, are not like, oh, okay, nobody's going to work here and it's, we're not going to get anything done and we're not going to be productive. No, but we're just going to adjust on the margins driven by the data, right, to help get through this very difficult period that's going to have payoffs for the lifetime of a worker.
Talking about top level talent, you're right, we're within the confines of a war for talent. In as much as you research the poaching and the poachers and the poachees, do you find that the incentives are what you're talking about? In as much as a company can extract top level female talent, does it coincide with some of the points that you're making, that they're offering this kind of predictability?
Well, I think, for example, I'll just give an example of the tech industry, which is, it's really fascinating because we actually see fewer women in the tech industry and more women in business, but there's a much smaller gender wage gap in tech, okay? And tech is where we've seen more female executives. So if you think about the Marissa Meyers and the Sheryl Sandbergs, okay? And it's interesting because you say, like, well, why is that? Why do we see fewer women in this field, but we actually see a smaller gender wage gap? And the reason is because there's certain forces that make a job harder to be compatible with the time squeeze. And this is something Nobel Prize winner Claudia Golden has talked a lot about. And so those forces are the more that you work as a team, the more that you have unstructured work, the more that you have client-facing work, which we see a lot in the business industry, right? The more it is efficient to have your workers work more and longer hours rather than to divide that work across multiple workers. Whereas in Silicon Valley, when it's more of an individual contribution, you can get the same output from 2 engineers working 40 hours each as you can from 1 engineer working 80 hours, if that makes sense. So this is something we call convex returns to hours that exists in the business world. And that force is what has made some of those jobs especially not female friendly, especially at the top, which is why you see that gender wage gap, even though, again, you see more women in this industry as they go into this industry, but then the gender wage gap appears because they drop out before they get to the highest paying levels. And so that's the evidence we have, the empirical evidence that a different type of work can be more compatible with female thriving, is that smaller gender wage gap in this kind of technologically different production that we see in tech firms. But we can learn to evolve and change how we produce. So every manufacturer knows that you can kind of change your production function. There's like a trade-off between capital and labor, right? And you can kind of get the same number of widgets by putting different inputs in. I know I'm getting a little technical here, but that is how we can think about adapting, to the different needs on our workers' time. And when I say that, I don't mean just women. I also mean men, because fewer and fewer men have a full-time stay-at-home spouse, right? 2 working parent households are kind of the norm. And so again, firms that are able to do this, I think they're going to have a competitive advantage in both domains, because that model of somebody's going to be able to take care of everything at home, I think that's an outdated model that we're seeing less and less, right? So when I say that we can evolve, let me give an example, which is the field of OBGYN. And this is an example that Claudia Golden talks about a lot in her Nobel Prize winning work. So OBGYN used to be a field like law, where if you had a client, you were on call. What I mean by that is if you had a pregnant woman, you had to deliver her baby whenever her baby came, right? So that made it a very not female-friendly position. And in fact, when you go back to 1970, only 7% of OBGYNs were female. But as more women went to medical school and more women started going into that profession, pregnant women actually wanted female doctors. And so there was a market demand for female doctors. And so these female doctors had to figure out how to make this profession work for them. And what they did was they organized into practices where a pregnant woman would see 5 people over the course of their pregnancy. They would have 1 primary doctor, but they would have intermittent appointments with these other doctors. And then whoever was on call when she went into labor was the one who would deliver the baby. So that means each of them only had to take 1/5 of the week on call instead of being on call all the time. And today, OBGYN is a massively female dominated specialty. Okay. So that's a field that technologically changed in a way that meant that it went from not being compatible with this kind of work-life balance to being compatible. And the end result, the outcome, the product didn't get any worse, right? It was just the structure that changed. And so I've pushed firms a lot to, again, think about being creative in that way of, let's say you're a law firm. Can you figure out ways to kind of build in a little bit of that duplication where different partners can have different on-call shifts so that you are able to offer those boundaries to your workers? And then you're still getting the same work product out, right? But you're adapting a little bit how it's delivered.
Right. And everything you're saying, by the way, makes not only kind of empirical sense, but almost just like a common sense. So let me ask about some of the barriers, or what are the structures holding this back? Some of this seems almost at the level of it's self-evident almost to treat people well, to get the most out of them. What are some of the structural barriers?
So I think one of them is just what I call Star Wars posters. And I call it that after this study that showed that when girls were shown a computer science classroom that was decorated with Star Wars posters, they were much less likely to want to take computer science than when they were shown kind of a neutrally decorated classroom. And so I think of some of the ways that we conduct ourselves in kind of corporate America as like those Star Wars posters. They're like relics from the past that nobody's taken down. And, it's just like, because the way we used to do things, it used to be all men, and this is kind of how we set it up, and it worked for them. And I think of that, I think the current career path of like you make peak investments in your 30s was because like that worked really well for men with stay-at-home wives, and I think we just might need to adapt and change. So some of it is that. Some of it has, I think, real costs. In the sense that, I've talked to law firms and, they're like, well, our clients want what they want. They want to talk to the partner that they want to talk to, and they don't want to have to talk to somebody else. And like, you can't tell them no, right? And I think we can push a little bit on that, right? Because I think you can tell them, well, between these hours and these hours, if you want somebody on the phone, it's going to be this person who's the kind of second partner on the case, right? But then your person is going to be able to get back to you by 7 p.m. So the same way we can kind of, impose structure, on our own lives, right? Just for ourselves. And people have told me that, like at law firms, you are allowed to say, like, look, I'm offline between 5 and 8, or I have a family event during these times, right? I think we can kind of be proactive in like imposing that structure on the work we do by communicating with clients, by saying like, hey, this is the way our firm works. And by the way, why would you choose our firm if there's another firm that doesn't work that way? Well, because maybe we're able to offer you this work for cheaper, right? Or with better quality talent because we're set up this way and we're retaining more talent. We're spending less on retaining that talent. So again, it's always like, yeah, there's a cost, but what are the benefits of being able to do this really well? And so, there are so many super talented lawyers who at some point leave to become kind of in-house, general counsel for a firm because the lifestyle is better, right? And, corporate law could retain those people by kind of making some of these slight adaptations. And, it's the same with a million other fields, where we see this, right? Like, I think there's consulting firms where, they try to implement some of this model of like, okay, you're always going to have 2 associates on this project so that, it's not, one person who's the person who has to be on call all the time, right? And like, there might be costs, there might be frictions. I think the important thing to stay focused on is that there's also a cost of not doing it.
Right. Yes. As we talked about, the cost of inaction and the cost of letting a competitor do it in lieu of you doing it. In terms of corporate America, do you find these arguments fall on deaf ears, or are we in a new era where you find leadership's actually listening to people like you?
I think the appetite has been there for a while. And that's why, as I've said, I've seen firms make big investments on the hiring side. And I think like we're doing so much better on that entry level side. And I think that's because of the investments that firms have made. And then I think, then as you go more senior, the cuts get a little bit deeper and it gets a little bit more painful to kind of make those changes. But I think the appetite is there to make those adaptations. I think we just need the research to guide us on what are the right adaptations. And so I think really being in tune with what are the forces that are constraining our workers' time so that we can alleviate the right things instead of spending money on stuff that might not actually matter as much. And I think that's what some of that like flexibility and work from home and all of that, we've seen as firms have really pushed on return to office, we've seen that they find work from home to be costly to them, right? And they don't want to do quite as much work from home. But I think if we're guided by the research, we would understand that actually we don't need full-time work from home. What we need is, some work from home, because that allows some kind of balancing of like you have a sick kid or, you need to like wait home for like the plumber, because again, there's no wife to do that anymore, right? For either our male or female employees, right? So we need the ability to have like sometimes work from home. So, for a lot of women tell me like 4 days a week in the office works great for them, right? And so firms would understand like, okay, we're spending so much to get our workers back in the office and try to make it fun and exciting. And we're bringing in like rock bands and clowns to try to get them in the office. But like maybe what we need instead is like a structure that says, hey, it's in the office, but it's 9 to 5 in the office 4 days a week. And then the rest of your hours, it's log on after 8 p.m. from home. It's log on Fridays from home. And I think we would find that model would deliver the value that firms are trying to get from return to office, and it would be like cheaper, right, to get that same amount of productivity from your workforce through that structure than through trying to like throw everything at the wall to like make the workplace like super fun so people want to be there.
And for companies, instead of hiring a rock band and a clown, they could get insane clown posse. See, two birds.
2 in 1.
2 birds, 1 stone. So, just to start to wind down, so far we've been talking about like almost like a superstructure, like a societal, organizational wide stuff. So I'd love to zoom in on the individual workers here and see things from their point of view. I think, as you rightly point out, if an individual woman is not getting far enough, it's likely not her own choices. It's this larger biological economic structure. So from the point of view of a working woman in 2025, to get some empathy there, what are their big struggles in terms of career and time management? And how does a book like yours help them get a semblance of control over that?
So I think the thing that my book does is it talks about, this economics concept of like a utility function. And a utility function is like not the same as just, money, right? We get utility from things that money can buy. We also get utility from things we spend our time on, like spending time with our kids or our elderly parents, right? We do that. And utility is also not the same thing as fun, because as I say that, right, I have a lot of friends right now who have aging parents who are doing things like cleaning out houses so their parents can downsize. We wouldn't call that fun, but it's something that we find valuable in terms of this story of our life, the things that bring meaning and value and fulfillment to our life. And that's what your utility function is. And so what the book does is it helps people understand, like, what is my utility function? What are the tools I have to maximize it, which is really, like my time, right? And the money I can earn with my time. And then what are the constraints that I face? And constraints such as the biological clock is one of those constraints. And how do I work around them? And so with that in mind, I encourage people to think of their career as a book with many chapters, where there's going to be, these periods where it's the squeeze and everything's hitting the fan at once. Well, that's a period where it actually might be smart during that one period, instead of saving, to actually be borrowing against your future earnings, so that you can alleviate some of the squeeze. And so, I talk about outsourcing, for example, and I kind of flip the script on outsourcing, that not outsourcing a task is choosing to hire yourself to do it. And we often do this a lot less with male-coded tasks. We don't have men do their own car repairs or, high-powered lawyers fixing their own plumbing. But with female-coded tasks, a lot of times we expect women to be able to do double duty, kind of insourcing those tasks and working full-time in the market. And so if you think about what your potential wage is, and it might not even be just your earnings right now, it's what's the value of a time investment in your career in terms of the payoff over the life cycle of your career, right? If you make partner, what's the payoff for that over the life cycle of your career? Should you actually hire yourself to do this job, or should you hire somebody else, right? And that's how I encourage people to think about outsourcing. And so I really talk about, like, how do you alleviate some of those constraints to get past the squeeze? Because then, again, your career is going to be a book with many chapters. There's going to be a chapter where you have more time and you have more money, and you're going to be able to, like, do some of the other things that you want to do that are a little bit extraneous right now. And I'm encouraging you to say no to right now, because right now you're maximally squeezed. And so I think the book has a lot of insight into, and when I give talks and I talk to people, I try to build it around what does this firm do and what are women facing at this firm, and kind of, talk about how in this kind of unique career path, how can we think about charting a course where your life at every stage can be sustainable, rich, and fulfilling, and you're ultimately getting where you want to go. Because the problem is there's a lot more exits than there are entry ramps, right, when it comes to these high-powered careers. And I think sometimes people make the mistake of saying, oh, things are so hard right now, I'm going to take the exit, but there's no way to get back on. So we need to think, okay, this is a short-term problem. How do I alleviate this short-term problem rather than making a permanent long-term decision based on the things that I'm facing right now?
Right. Because, for instance, I don't like flying, and there's always inevitably turbulence. And it comes in 10 seconds, a minute, but it doesn't stop me from flying the next time. It's just something I know will happen. As a society, do you think people think about their career in these stages as you're outlining here, in terms of there's the squeeze stage, there's the post 30 stage, or is it just the next quarter, and everything's set up short term?
Well, yeah, I think that's exactly, my book talks about some of the behavioral economics forces that affect us. And we do have that tendency, right, to have tunnel vision or myopia and be focused on what's right in front of us. And I think from a utility maximization perspective, that's a real mistake. And the same way behavioral economists kind of have talked a lot about how we make mistakes when we're trying to diet, but we grab the thing that's right in front of us, or we make mistakes when we're trying to save money, but we purchase the temptation good, right? I think we should talk about how some of these behavioral economics forces actually impact the deeper story of our lives, right? And the choice that we make over this 80-year life cycle. And so I think what my book encourages people to do is actually take a step back and look at their life that way, right? And say, okay, I'm putting my nose to the grindstone right now. What's the payoff? What's the path that I'm on? How is this going to add up to maximizing my utility across my life? And it means making some different decisions. It means before you get into the squeeze, I talk about this period in your 20s where you have time but no money. And I say in your 20s, it's actually a mistake to go into debt or spend a bunch of money that you don't have, because that's going to make things harder for you once you enter the squeeze, and you're not there yet, right? So you don't want to make things harder by the time you get to your 30s. So it's some of those things, when you kind of take this longer view, you see okay, here's what the data says. And this is data that people haven't seen before. So it's having the data is helpful, right? Here's what the data says about when my time use is going to become most intensive. This is the period when it's going to be. How do I plan for that period? How do I get through it? And how do I thrive anyway?
And I think one of the unique things about your book is that you say economists study people as economic agents, but we should apply that to women specifically as a group. Can you talk a bit about that, of looking at women as economic agents, but from the point of view of a woman?
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, the question that you asked me, you said, do we think that people kind of think about this time horizon when they think about their careers? When economists think about financial planning or retirement planning, they have all of these theories about how, a worker thinks about, okay, well, my income's going to fall at retirement. Here's how much I need to save now. And so this is what my permanent income is over time. So we kind of think that people, but they really mean men, kind of have this long-term time horizon. But then suddenly people take that hat off or that lens off when they're talking about women. And so I remember when I first started presenting my work on reproductive capital, I was studying a law that made IVF free. And people asked, and I was showing that it impacted the decision of 22-year-old women to go to graduate school, right? And people were asking well, do women really think that long term, that IVF is free, that's going to affect them when they're in their 20s? And I'm yes, if we think that men are planning for retirement when they're choosing their college major, right? Then yes, women are thinking about whether they can have a kid when they're 35, when they're choosing whether to go to graduate school at 22, right? But I think what women haven't had is sort of a guide to put all those tools out there explicitly, right? Give them a toolkit to say hey, here's how you use those tools of economics to do this for yourself, and to really kind of break it down and make it explicit.
And what advice would you have for women? I know you talk to your students, you go out, give talks, and you give interviews. What's a good bit of advice for women to advocate for themselves in the face of status quo thinking and stasis? Let's say their company has not read your book, is not advanced on that tier. Well, what's a good bit of advice for advocacy, self advocacy?
Yeah. I think that your power when you're negotiating, I think a lot of people think that it only comes from kind of your outside option or your what we call your BATNA, your best alternative to negotiated agreement. For sure, like knowing your worth, getting a price on yourself in the market, knowing your BATNA, that's part of your power, but that's not actually your power when you're negotiating. Your power is your ability to show and demonstrate the path to a win-win solution. So I've also done some studying on negotiation, and I have one study with girls in Zambia trying to get their parents to pay for schooling. And the way that they did it was by showing that this was win-win for the family, right? It wasn't by demonstrating their BATNA and their willingness to walk away, because a girl cannot walk away. She is dependent on her family, right? And so, that wasn't what was going to be her power here. The power was going to be showing, hey, this is potentially a win for both of us. And so I think what, women have to do is they have to put themselves in the perspective, take the perspective of the firm, put themselves in those shoes and say, what is the firm trying to accomplish here? And how does getting what I need also serve the interests of the firm? And I think that is there, that shared interest is actually there, because as I said, if you can make things work for women, then you can retain talent and you can invest in talent that your competitors aren't getting, right? So I think, when women are talking about things like taking maternity leave and here's what I need, right? They should bring the data and say, I'm here in the squeeze, right? But here's my potential working life. And here's like what I'm going to be able to contribute to the farm, right? If we're able to get through this period, if you're able to invest in me, right? Or, women should bring the data, for example, that I have in my book about how what women bring to the table in terms of their skills can be more valuable. So I have, research on negotiation, for example, showing that men were in one study over 200% more likely to have negotiation breakdown than female negotiators were and walk away from the table with zero, right? So to say, here's the value that I bring to the table, and here's why making some of these tweaks, right, are really going to create value for the firm. And so I talk about some of those conversations, in my book, and I think that's what I think, women have to get good at, right, is seeing the win-win solution and seeing that, their needs actually don't have to be in competition with the company's needs, that there are ways that getting what they need is going to serve the interests of the firm and serve the interests of the client.
What are the stakes here? Like, what would you hope that somebody reading the book or listening to you talk about it, what would you hope that they come to understand about this world? And what would you hope they'd maybe do something differently in their own lives after hearing from you?
Well, I think there are certainly some things that have changed, but there are some things that are the same. Like when we look at the data, the gender wage gap hasn't closed in over 25 years. So it was narrowing to the end of the 20th century, and then it's completely flattened out. And so things haven't been adding up for women for a long time. And maybe now we're reaching maybe more of a crisis point, but I think that those forces were already there. And I think one of the things that's making this more salient is the fertility crisis that people are talking about all around the world, that we're seeing fertility drop in a lot of developed countries. And people are very worried about what that means financially for the functioning of those countries, because, you rely on your prime age workers to pay for your retired workers, right? And I think the answer to that is in the data. It's that what it takes to produce a child is more intensive than ever before, and it's adding up less for women than ever before. And so I think when we invest in women and invest in making their lives more sustainable, we are literally investing in the future of humanity, the survival of our nations and our species. And so this couldn't be more urgent, right? And it's something that impacts all of us. And so I think that is the piece, the big takeaway that I'd like us to kind of like reframe from things being like women's issues versus, like men's issues or versus the interests of the firm, to understanding that our destiny is shared, and investing in women is really investing in a future and a path forward for all of us.
That's about as wide of a scope and a scale as you can get. Hey, just as the last thing, as it's a kind of bonus thing. I mean, you mentioned Sheryl Sandberg and Lean In, and in terms of this space, I started asking about other books in this field. Everyone kind of knows that book in corporate America. It sold millions of copies. It's has a sort of can-do, literally lean in attitude. What are your own feelings toward that book? Because in having it all, you do mention it. I think you give it its props where it's due, but maybe you have a different path towards success.
Yeah, I think that, Lean In defined a vision of success that I think was trying to mirror the male career path as much as possible and make it easier for women to mirror that path as much as possible. And it makes sense, because if you say men are CEOs, and if you want women to be CEOs, they better start, working more like men, right? I have a section in the book that's called Work Like a Girl and Get Paid for It, because the research does not support that men's traits are more productive in the workplace. There's actually a lot of research showing that, like some of the traits I talked about, negotiation, for example, but there's also research on competition, risk aversion, that some of the traits that women bring to the table could actually be, in some cases, more valuable. And in some cases, what you want is like a diversity of styles, because you want the people who are going to be a little bit more risk taking, and you want the people who are going to be a little bit more risk averse, right? So I think my book is asking women to figure out what it looks like to really succeed as themselves versus trying to fit this one particular model. And I think that's kind of, what is needed for the new generation. So, that was like, we had Lean In. The reality is, since Lean In came out, we have not seen the gender wage gap close. That has not solved the problem, right? So just women trying to kind of be more like men has not resulted in any measurable change in kind of, where women sit and how much they're earning in the corporate world. So I think instead we need to think a little bit about the structural problems, and we need to think about how can we create a workplace that works for everyone, instead of women fitting this old, and as I said, increasingly outdated mold that's outdated for both men and women.
Right. Actually, two follow-ups to the follow-up. In your ostensible chapter about Lean In, or in the chapter title that contains the chapter is called Level Up. Don't lean in, level up. Can you talk about what leveling up means for women?
Yeah. So what I mean by level up is, lean in is like, I think of it as like, try harder, but leave the structure the same, right? And I think of level up as change the structure to some extent, right? And so when I'm thinking about that, that could be in the workplace, like level up by changing how your team works. Like, if a lot of these women who are going to read my book are managers themselves. So like, actually change how your team works, change how, you handle client requests, change how you, change the workflow. But it also can be a lot in your personal life, which is like, you are comparing yourself to a man with a full-time stay-at-home spouse in the workplace, but you're also comparing yourself to a mom who works part-time or as a stay-at-home wife at home, and you're trying to like build the structure of your life to like mirror that vision of success. And, I see this take all sorts of forms. It could be that, and this is a story that's in my book, you're living in Connecticut because you want your kids to have like the white picket fence and the pool in the backyard, but that means that you're actually commuting 90 minutes to work while you're the breadwinner, okay? A level up, and this is the story of the woman in my book, is moving back to the city to be, a 20-minute commute from work and having a superintendent who can fix your house instead of a million projects piling up, right? So that would be like a level up, right? It's changing the structure of your life. It's, going from saying, okay, my kids have to go to this school that's across town because they love it there, and they have to do 16 different summer camps because they want a different camp each week, right? To saying, actually, what my kids need is for me to be sane and present. And for me to be sane and present, I need to spend less time in the car and less time on logistics and more time being with them. And so I'm going to change that structure to make it possible.
So that's a good understanding of leveling up. And just as the final follow-up to the follow-up, the question is about this young generation, not only of women, but of leaders, as we get further away from that kind of, to me, almost ground zero baseline, like industrial model of labor and production and corporate America, is it your belief and your hope that things really will change circa 2025, not only because of the young women entering the workforce, but because the leaders are just farther away from these old models that you just mentioned?
I think that what I would say is I don't think things are going to change on their own. I don't think I have a lot of hope that like people are just going to be like, oh, okay, let's do it this way. You know, I think that it's going to take concerted advocacy and visionary leaders. And I think for things to change, it's going to be the leaders, those visionary leaders, certain firms who are going to make those changes. And they're going to win by making those changes. And then other firms are going to want to copy those changes, right? And so I think that's, people talk a lot about kind of, Silicon Valley, how they started competing on perks to retain workers because there was such a war on talent, right? And it was, a certain firm kind of, hey, we're offering this. And now everybody has to offer that, right? So I think what's going to make the change is that it's real visionary leaders, especially as startups become like an increasing portion of the economy. A lot of my Wharton MBA students say like, oh, I'm going to do this differently at my firm that I'm starting because like I took your class and I learned that this is what's going to make it work more for women and make it better for us to retain talent. So I think as those firms start to win by making those choices, then we're going to see that kind of percolate through. But then I think the other thing that's going to change is the market demand from women themselves, where if women pushed back a little bit to say like, no, I'm not going to lean in. I want the level up, right? I want something that's actually going to make this structurally work for me. Then I think that's going to put some market pressure also on firms to change. And that's going to help kind of like lead us there. And then, of course, like I think then the third tier of that, so it's like the firms, it's the women, and the third tier of that is policy, right? And then I think it's going to take a while for us to get there, but we have to keep demonstrating that value in some of these kind of like supportive policy changes, because there are things that like policies could help with. For example, like one of the things I talk about is that I think there's a huge loss of value in our economy from the women who have stepped out of the workforce to parent children, and their kids go to high school by the time they're 45 years old or something, right? And they have a long period of working and productivity ahead of them. But as I said, there's no on-ramps to get back into those high investment careers. And I have so many friends who are like, high-powered investment bankers who then, once their kids went to school, ended up interviewing for entry-level jobs, right? So that is something policy could support by offering some tax incentives to firms for, recruiting female workers back into the workforce at the point in time when their kids enter school, and whether that's kindergarten or high school when kids become even more self-sufficient when they get their driver's license, right? So that's something policy could support. And, that doesn't have to be national policy. That can also be state and local policy. And so that's why I hope that by putting some of this research out, we're going to have an evidence base to kind of guide, like, what are some of the policies that could really matter and are really supported by evidence, instead of just kind of throwing money everywhere.
So the answer, the TLDR answer is change definitely possible, but it'll take work, as most change decides.
Yes, and advocacy, and and not giving up, and the vision on the part of some firms, which I really hope to see, and that's why I hope to kind of share this research with firms so that they can see the vision and buy into the vision and be part of that change.
That's right, because without the vision undergirding and overreaching, it's just a bunch of numbers that you can look at. So that's a good point to make. Corinne, thank you for this.
We have these conversations with Lavin speakers every week. If you like what you heard, please subscribe at YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on Corinne or any Lavin speakers, visit thelavinagency.com. Thanks for listening.